Chapter 3, Misha. I spent most days in the attic. The habit had formed slowly during the first year after the accident, when confusion and heartache tangled together so tightly that I could barely bring myself to wander through the rest of the house. The attic had felt safer then, removed from the painful routines unfolding downstairs. But today the cramped space felt unbearable. The dusty beams, the forgotten boxes, the stale stillness that never seemed to change, every corner of that attic had begun pressing against my patience. I had drifted up there again out of habit early in the morning, settling into the same spot where I usually watched the faint light crawl through the narrow window. By noon, I couldn't stand it anymore. So I left. I wandered into the backyard, passing through the ceiling and down into the living room before slipping through the back door without needing to touch it. The sensation of moving through walls had stopped feeling strange years ago. At first, it had terrified me. My body simply dissolved through solid surfaces as though the physical world no longer applied to me. Now it barely registered. The backyard stretched out behind the house exactly as it had before. The small wooden fence bordered the grass, separating the yard from the neighboring property. Zara had planted flowers along the edges during our second spring there, determined to turn the bare strip of dirt into a place that held color. Those flowers had survived longer than I had. I wandered across the yard slowly, letting my gaze drift over the familiar vicinity. It wasn't that I couldn't leave the house. Nothing was stopping me from walking down the street or wandering through the city if I really wanted to. I had tested that theory once during the early months after the accident, drifting through several blocks just to prove that the invisible boundary I imagined didn't actually exist. But every time I left for too long, I ended up coming back anyway. There was nowhere else I truly wanted to be. So, most days I lingered here. While Zara worked at the clinic, the house remained silent. I drifted through the house, sometimes sitting in the kitchen watching sunlight stretch across the counters, sometimes pacing the passage just to pass the hours. And when evening came, I watched her return. That part never became easier. I stood noiselessly in the living room while she stepped through the front door, her shoulders already slumped with exhaustion from the day. Sometimes she would drop her keys on the counter and stare at the wall for several seconds before moving again, as though gathering the strength to face another night alone. Other times, she moved through the house mechanically, eating dinner without enthusiasm, showering quickly, then disappearing into the bedroom. Most nights ended the same way. She cried herself to sleep. I sat beside her through those nights, watching helplessly as grief worked through her chest in waves she tried desperately to muffle. 3 years had passed since the accident. Years since my body stopped breathing in that hospital room. And yet my existence hadn't ended. Instead, I remained here. A wandering presence with no purpose. At first, I had expected a grand spectacle. A marked transition. A tunnel of light, perhaps, or a celestial gate parting to draw me onward. Even though I had never believed strongly in religious explanations for death, the stories still lingered in the back of my mind. Instead, I woke up in the attic. And nothing else happened after that. Years later, nothing had changed. I spent a lot of time during those first months thinking about the rules ghosts followed in movies. Those stories offered some explanation for why spirits lingered in the world of the living. Unfinished business. Revenge. A terrible injustice demanding resolution. Sometimes the spirit had been murdered and refused to move on until the truth came out. Sometimes they lingered because an unfinished purpose still held them there, a task left incomplete that refused to release its claim. I searched my life for those reasons again and again. None of them applied. My death had been sudden, yes. A terrible accident that arrived without warning. But my life before that night had been full and complete in ways I had never taken for granted. I had married the woman I loved. I had built a career that brought me genuine happiness. My restaurant had grown into far more than I ever imagined when I first opened its doors, expanding beyond those early ambitions into a presence that felt almost alive. My parents were proud of me. My sister called every week just to argue about recipes. There had been love in every direction of my life. So why was I still here? The question had followed me through every empty day. I had never believed in a God I couldn't prove existed. Faith had seemed a comforting story people told themselves when life became too chaotic to explain. Even when friends talked about heaven and divine plans, I listened politely without ever truly accepting the idea. Sometimes I wondered if that disbelief had trapped me here. Perhaps whatever force governed the afterlife had decided that a person without faith deserved to remain stuck between worlds. But that theory didn't make much sense either. If religious stories held any truth at all, I should have been sent somewhere by now. Heaven, hell, purgatory, every belief system offered some version of what happened after death. Instead, I wandered through my old home, invisible to the living, unable to interact with the world in any meaningful way. That didn't feel like divine judgment. It read as a glitch in existence. I stopped beside the rose bushes Zara had planted along the fence and lowered myself to sit beside them. The flowers had grown beautifully over the years. Deep red petals unfolded to the afternoon sun, their color bright against the green leaves surrounding them. Zara had continually loved these roses. I leaned closer out of habit, instinctively expecting the familiar fragrance to reach me. Nothing came. The absence of sensation had been one of the cruelest discoveries during my early days as whatever I had become. I couldn't smell anything anymore. Food no longer carried flavor. Not that I could eat it anyway. Even the sound of Zara's presence had begun fading slowly over time. Her words reached me less clearly than they used to, as though the distance between us grew wider with each passing year. Sometimes I wondered if that meant I was slowly disappearing. Perhaps this was how the process worked. First, the senses faded. Then the memories. Then, eventually, even the identity itself dissolved until nothing remained. Maybe souls lingered serenely until the last piece of who they were simply faded away. The thought should have frightened me. In its place, it mostly irritated me. Years of wandering without purpose had drained the drama out of existential questions. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals brushing against one another in a soft movement I could see but never feel. Nothing about this existence had spared me from irritation lately. The endless waiting. The unanswered questions. The dull repetition of watching life continue without my involvement. With a frustrated sigh, I pushed myself up from the ground and turned to the house again. Moving through the yard no longer required effort. My body, or whatever remained of it, barely disturbed the grass beneath my steps. When I reached the back door, I passed straight through it without slowing down. Doors had stopped meaning anything to me. Walls didn't either. I could move through them whenever I wanted. Oddly enough, floors still held me up when I walked across them. I had discovered early on that I didn't fall through the ground unless I intentionally tried to sink downward. Most of the time, I drifted along the surface as if gravity still had some claim over me. No rule explained why. Nothing about this half-existence followed clear logic anyway. So, I simply moved through the house as I usually did, wandering from room to room while the afternoon stretched endlessly around me. Night settled over the house slowly. The last of the daylight had already slipped behind the neighboring rooftops when the familiar sound of Zara's car finally pulled into the driveway. I had been drifting through the living room for the better part of an hour, pacing without purpose as I often did when evening approached. Even after all this time, I still found myself waiting for that sound. The car door shut. Footsteps followed a few seconds later. The front door opened, and Zara stepped inside, juggling several grocery bags in one hand while trying to keep her phone pressed between her shoulder and the side of her head. She nudged the door closed behind her with her foot before crossing the living room to the kitchen. I followed automatically, drawn to her presence as I always was. The bags rustled softly as she set them down on the kitchen counter one by one. A carton of eggs appeared first, followed by vegetables, a loaf of bread, and a few containers I couldn't identify from where I stood. Her posture carried the familiar exhaustion of a person who had just finished a long day. "Yes, I know," she said into the phone, her shoulder lifting slightly to keep the device from slipping. "And it's going to be fine. I'm really not panicking as much as you think I am." Her words reached me faintly. Hearing people had become harder over time. Sound traveled through me now in a strange, distant way, as though every conversation took place on the other side of a thin wall. I had to concentrate carefully to catch the details. I drifted closer to the counter and leaned against it beside her, focusing on the shape of her words as she continued speaking. "This Saturday?" she asked suddenly, her eyebrows rising with surprise. "Isn't that a little too early?" I frowned slightly. "Saturday? Too early for what?" Curiosity pulled me even closer as I settled beside her, my concentration fixed entirely on the conversation she was having. "Come on, Riley," Zara continued after a brief pause. "You're acting as if this is some kind of emergency." "Ah. Riley." That explained the tone. "This is ridiculous," Zara muttered, shaking her head as she began unpacking the grocery bags one item at a time. "I'm not repeating after you." She stopped briefly while Riley spoke again through the phone. Zara's face loosened slowly from annoyance to reluctant acceptance. "Fine," she said with a sigh. "Fine. I can do this." Another pause. "I can be myself again." The words left her mouth carefully, as if she needed to convince herself of them before saying them out loud. "It's okay to date again," she continued, her voice carrying a trace of irritation now. "There. I said it. Happy?" My entire body froze. "Dating?" I shouted instinctively, the word bursting out of me before I had time to process what she had just said. The reaction came from pure shock. It wasn't as if she could hear me. She never could. But then an odd stillness took hold. Zara stopped moving. The carton of milk hovered halfway between the grocery bag and the refrigerator as her head tilted slightly. Her gaze moved across the kitchen in slow confusion, sweeping the area as though an unexpected sound had reached her ears. My entire form went rigid. For a split instant, it almost seemed as if she were staring directly at me. I immediately clamped my palm over my mouth out of pure instinct, the ridiculous gesture arriving before logic had time to catch up. The motion made absolutely no sense. I had spent years speaking freely without anyone ever reacting, but in that brief instant, it felt safer to pretend I had been silent all along. Zara's eyes moved across the kitchen again. A faint crease formed between her brows. She appeared unsettled. For a moment, I thought she might actually see me. Then she shook her head slightly, dismissing whatever sensation had unsettled her, and returned her attention to the call. "Sorry," she muttered into the phone. "I thought I heard a noise." She listened again while Riley spoke. I leaned closer, trying to catch the rest of the conversation. "Yes," Zara said after a moment. "Saturday is fine." Another pause. "No, I'm not canceling. I said I'll do it." She rubbed her forehead with her free hand, clearly exhausted by the entire conversation. "Yes, Riley. I promise I'll behave as a functional adult." A beat of silence passed. "Good night." The call ended. Zara lowered the phone slowly and placed it on the counter beside the groceries. She simply stood there staring down at the marble surface, her shoulders slightly slumped. Then she gathered the remaining bags and finished unpacking them without another word. When the last item had been put away, she grabbed her phone again and walked to the stairway that led to the bedroom. "I need a shower," she muttered to herself as she disappeared up the stairs. The bedroom door closed behind her a few seconds later. I remained standing in the kitchen, completely stunned. The peaceful house suddenly felt much smaller. "Dating?" I repeated slowly to the empty room. My mind struggled to keep up with the implications of that single word. Zara was going to start dating again. The idea spun wildly through my thoughts, refusing to settle into anything that resembled acceptance. "Isn't it a little soon for that?" I demanded out loud, pacing the length of the kitchen in growing agitation. 3 years. Yes, it had technically been years. But that hardly seemed enough time for any of this. Shouldn't there be some kind of universal rule about these things? 10 years felt reasonable. Maybe even longer. Or better yet, she could simply remain devoted to my memory forever. That would be the respectful option, I muttered under my breath. The more I thought about it, the more outrageous the situation became. My wife was preparing to go on a date with a person who was definitely not me. My thoughts spiraled faster with every passing second. What am I supposed to do about that? I demanded of the silent kitchen. Because suddenly a terrifying realization had taken hold. Zara was going to move forward. She was going to meet new people. Maybe fall in love again. Build a future that no longer includes me. Meanwhile, I would remain stuck here, wandering through the same rooms, watching life continue without my participation. The thought sent a sharp wave of panic through me. This can't be happening, I muttered, running both palms through my hair as frustration bubbled up inside my chest. Frustration built inside me until it had nowhere left to go. I slammed my palm against the kitchen counter, the sound echoing through the empty room even though no living person could hear it. The anger had been simmering beneath the surface ever since Zara walked down the corridor to the stairway. My thoughts refused to settle, circling the same impossible reality again and again. She was going to date someone. That single idea had set off a storm inside my mind. As my palm struck the counter, a strange sensation rippled through me. The change arrived so abruptly that it pulled me out of the spiral of irritation building in my chest. The dull haze that had clouded my senses began to dissolve. My surroundings sharpened. The outlines of the kitchen cabinets appeared clearer than they had been earlier in the evening. The muted sounds of the house, pipes shifting behind the walls, the distant hum of the refrigerator motor, reached me with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Even the constant pressure inside my thoughts, the one that made things feel sluggish and far, lifted as if suddenly a veil was pulled from my mind. I stood there blinking, trying to understand what had just happened. For the first time in what had been an eternity, the whole thing returned to how it had been during those early days after the accident. My awareness felt fully present again. My thoughts moved without the heavy resistance that had slowly crept in over the past years. It almost resembled waking up. Not literally, of course. I remained exactly what I had been since the night my body stopped breathing. Dead. But the strange fog that had been dulling my senses had vanished. I was still trying to process the change when a hand settled on my shoulder. The contact sent a violent jolt through my entire body. A scream burst out of me before my mind had time to react, the sound escaping with the same high-pitched panic a teenager might produce during a horror movie jump scare. I spun around in pure instinct, desperate to see who, or what, had just touched me. The sudden movement threw me completely off balance. My foot slipped through the floor as I turned, and my body followed without resistance. The ground swallowed me halfway before I had time to react, the familiar disorienting sensation of drifting through solid wood sending another wave of panic through me. Hey! Careful! A hand grabbed my arm. The grip tightened firmly around my wrist before pulling upward with surprising strength. My body rose again through the floor as if gravity had suddenly changed its mind. I stumbled forward as my feet returned to the surface of the kitchen. For the first time in years, a figure had physically stopped me from falling through the house. I stared at the person standing in front of me. She appeared to be around my age, perhaps a little younger. Her dark hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and her posture carried an easy confidence that made the entire situation feel strangely casual. A friendly smile rested on her face as though she had just interrupted an awkward social moment rather than the existential meltdown of a wandering ghost. Her fingers were still wrapped around my wrist. "Who are you?" I blurted immediately. The questions burst out of me faster than I could organize them. "What are you doing in my house? Where did you come from? And how the hell can you see me?" The woman raised both eyebrows slightly, clearly amused by the rapid interrogation. "All right," she said calmly, lifting one hand in a soothing gesture. "First thing you should do is breathe. You're not in any danger." That statement alone felt absurd. I had died in a car accident and spent years haunting my own house. The concept of danger had already lost most of its meaning. She released my wrist and extended her hand politely. "My name is Rebecca Jones," she said, her smile widening with the effortless warmth of a person introducing herself at a friendly gathering. I used to live in the house next door. I died in 2005. She grasped my hand before I had the chance to decide whether I actually wanted to shake it. Her grip moved up and down in a brief, cheerful motion before she finally let go. "It's nice to finally meet you," she added. I stared at her. "You died?" Rebecca nodded, completely unfazed. "Yes." I hesitated before asking the next question, though the answer already felt obvious. "You're a ghost too?" Her grin widened immediately. "Exactly the same situation as you." The words took a moment to settle inside my head. My gaze drifted to the walls separating our house from the neighboring property, then back to her again. "You live next door?" Rebecca tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well," she corrected gently, "I was killed next door." She said the sentence with such casual ease that it took me another moment to fully process what she had just admitted. "But once you're in this state," she continued, gesturing loosely around the room, "property lines stop being very important. I wander wherever I feel comfortable." Her expression softened slightly as she studied me. "I used to see you and your wife all the time," she added. "You two were constantly caught up in shared pursuits, rarely apart. Cooking, laughing, arguing about what movie to watch. It was obvious you cared about each other." My confusion deepened. "You used to watch us?" Rebecca nodded again. "And I've been watching you ever since the accident," she continued. Her tone lifted just enough to suggest concern beneath the friendliness. "For 3 years." The words landed heavily. "I tried saying hello a few times," she added. "So did a few others." My head snapped up. "A few others?" Rebecca's smile turned slightly sheepish. "You couldn't see any of us," she explained. Which we all thought was very strange. The kitchen suddenly felt much smaller. "You mean there are more of you?" I asked slowly. "Of course." My thoughts scrambled to keep up with the expanding list of revelations. "You watched me while I was alive," I said carefully. "You were murdered next door. And now there's apparently a whole community of invisible ghosts wandering around my neighborhood." Rebecca tilted her head sympathetically. "Pretty much." I rubbed my forehead, trying to make sense of the avalanche of information. "Wait," I said suddenly. "You were killed? By whom?" Rebecca winced slightly. "Ah. Oh, honey," she said gently, placing a guiding hand against my shoulder again. This time I didn't scream. "You might want to sit down before we get into all of that." She steered me into the living room with determination, guiding me through the door as if I were still a living person who needed help settling down. We reached the couch, and she gently pushed me into a seated position. The gesture was unnecessary. My physical body no longer existed, and furniture had long ago stopped serving any real purpose for me. Yet the act of sitting carried a strange comfort. Perhaps some part of my mind still clung to the habits of being human. Rebecca settled beside me, crossing one leg over the other as though preparing to share a long and complicated story. "All right," she said with a patient smile. "Let's start from the beginning.